Grose. Nice to have you with us. I'm very interested about your latest or republished book, Why Firstborns Rule the World and Laterborns Want to Change It. I believe you wrote this in 2003, and this is an updated version. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I wrote it it's 18 years since the first one came out. And I've been asked why rewrite it, what's changed in birth order? Well, nothing's changed with birth order. Theory is still the same, but the context is quite different. So when I first wrote it, the mean number of kids that Australian families had was 3. So we had a lot of three-child families. And in the 2 decades ensuing, the mean number of kids is 2. So families have shrunk dramatically in that time. So right now, we've got 60% of Australian families with kids under the age of 15 with 2-child or less. So we've moved away from larger families. Not that 3 is a large family by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly families have shrunk quite dramatically in that time. And that's certainly impacted birth order. And that's one of the reasons why I changed the name from Why Firstborns Rule the World and Lastborns Want to Change It to Firstborns Rule the World and Laterborns Want to Change It. Subtle shift, but it reflects in some ways the changes as well.
Michael, I believe you're a teacher, a father. How did you come into the studies of birth order? It's not something that's really discussed a lot, or something I believe that with in parenting communities anyway, as a parent, obviously, editor of Offspring Parenting Magazine, it's not something that I've come across much research on or many discussions among peers with about. How did you get into it?
Yeah, good. I guess that's how long have we got? But no, that's a good question. So I sort of answer that one quickly. I was a primary teacher for about 15 years, and I went to, I'm in Melbourne, Victoria based. I went to Monash Uni to do a Masters of Education, and I did a subject called individual psychology, which is an unusual psychology in Australia. It's more American based and actually quite popular in Europe. And Adlerian psychology, as it's also known, basically Adlerian psychology looks at the individual as part of a group. So it never looks at an individual. So it came up, Adler and Freud were together. Freud said, you want to understand someone, you've got to understand their psyche and their inner world, etc. And Alfred Adler said, no, if you want to understand someone, you've got to look at them in the context in which they are. So you need to look at the group, the family, or if they're in a class, look at the whole class. And so he was the first person to come up with birth order theory. And basically the first group you belong to is your family. And he came up with the birth order theory. I continued on that work. I moved in, became an Adlerian family counsellor, which meant that we would look at families through the eyes of birth order. So
I've noted in researching a little bit about your findings and in your work that a lot of firstborns, as you were saying, tend to be world leaders, American presidents, and other influential people such as, I believe, Oprah, other people who are quite well known in the media. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, look, just because you're firstborn doesn't mean that you're going to be leadership material, and it doesn't mean that also just because you're not a firstborn doesn't mean you're not going to be a prime minister or a president. Interestingly, our current prime minister, Scott Morrison, is second-born, and Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand is a second-born as well. I would argue that they actually govern and lead in a way which reflects their birth order in some ways. It's a bit more like second-borns, but that's probably extrapolated.
And how's that, Michael? What ways?
More charismatic leadership style, more people-based leadership style, both of them significantly. Same with Bob Hawke, very much that people person, which is characteristic of that birth order position. US President now, Joe Biden, is a firstborn. And then you'll get a character like Donald Trump comes along who throws out all the rules, but I think he may have a disorder as well. So that's, so it can't take it too far.
What's his birth order, out of interest?
Look, you could actually argue that the birth order theory holds up reasonably well there. He He was second, but his elder brother, his father, ridiculed. So, what, so the father was a very strict, very successful, influential business person, and he trained his sons to be along the same lines as him, which was, this is what I've read, my learnings about him, that he trained his sons to be ruthless. And his eldest son wasn't ruthless. It was Fred. And he ridiculed his son. So his eldest son, he almost went a different way. So Donald basically took over the firstborn's mantle.
Firstborn, can that happen in a family?
Yeah, it does. It does. It happens a lot. Doesn't happen a lot. It happens at times. Just because you're born first doesn't mean you're going to always be the firstborn. Gender can play a part. Temperament can play a part. It's more likely that you will be. And it's largely because when parents have kids, we always have hopes and dreams, and they go on the aspirations, and they tend to go on the firstborn's shoulders. And that's why the firstborns are what we call the family conservatives. So that means if it's an academic family, reasonable chance the firstborn will be an academic, will go down that path. And of course, a lot of responsibility goes their way. It's look after your little brother, look after your sister, or whatever it is. So we tend to give them extra responsibility. Also, somewhere along the line, primogeniture takes over. And primogeniture is when there's the notion of someone's got to look after this family. Someone's going to be the spokesperson for this family. And so if we go back in history, it's often the firstborn and male that the resources were given towards, who often inherited the land, if there was land to inherit, etc. So inherited the crown. And so the firstborn has often been put on a pedestal, and I've always called it a regal position as well. So there is something
Prince William versus Harry.
Well,
right
William
now
is the heir and Harry is the spare. And they're the poster kids for birth order in some ways, because what we know is that first and second tend to be different. Sometimes the differences can be very subtle. Sometimes they could be vast. And William's your perfect firstborn. He's a rule keeper. He's a conservative. That is in the family frame. He's gone that family way. He did everything perfectly, married the right sort of person which fits into the royal, to being queen. I think that's what she might be called when she actually gets to that position. I'm not sure what that will be. And then you got Harry. Poor old Harry. Not only was he the spare, but every time William has another child, he moves back in line. And it's not only is he different than his elder brother, and his elder brother, you can't be two of them. But also he has some youngest born characteristics, which is a bit of a challenger. They like to change things up very much, and which is what he's doing since he's opted out of the royal family, isn't he ever? So they're almost a pigeon pair or poster kids for a new position, and that new position is what I call the Prince Harry effect. Thank you, Harry, for coming along. I'd already identified it as when families had shrunk to small families. We've got a lot of families with just two kids. What I was seeing is that a lot of the second born had third youngest characteristics. So when I first wrote Why Firstborns in 2003, the second child was very similar to a middle child. In fact, I put seconds and middles together in a chapter, and a lot of birth order, when it's discussed, is often the second and middle will go together.
And that could be set in, say, a family of 5, second, third, fourth would all have similar characteristics.
Yeah, it can be. Look, you can get, again, this is where it's not a neat set of numbers. I'll just explain it this way very quickly. I prefer to refer to it as family constellation. So just like you get a constellation of stars always has its own pattern, well, a family constellation will have its own pattern. Gender impacts, the space between kids impacts, special needs impacts. If you've got a special needs child, that will impact. A death in the family will impact. Sometimes the parents' culture, if they value one gender over another, will impact things like twins impact. So there's a bunch of stuff which comes in. Once you sort of understand the pattern and some of the rules, then it all starts to make sense. So I'll set that up to say, you may have 5 kids, for example, but maybe the third one, you might have 4 boys and a girl. Well, girl's in a special position on her own down the bottom of the family. Not only is she the youngest, but she's almost the family jewel because she's the girl. She's got a lot of dads and looking after her, so to speak. So you've good chance that maybe the third or the fourth might be more like a middle. Or sorry, the second or the third. The fourth would almost be like a youngest because he's the youngest boy. And the third or the second or the third would probably be more like a middle. Because whenever you get a number of kids, you'll always get one who's a bit more squeezed out than others. So it won't necessarily be, right, got 5 kids, it's going to be the third one. It mightn't work out that way. And it's what happens within families is you get sub-families. If you've got a family of, I spoke to someone recently, family of 9, and there works out there were 3 families within that. And the person who I was speaking with, she was 7th in the family, but she identified it as a firstborn because there was a gap between her and her elder sibling, and she had 2 younger boys very quickly came under her. And as she said, well, I basically brought them up sort of thing. So, yeah.
And you're seeing that more with blended families and
that's how it plays out in blended families. That's for sure. Blended families or birth order is one of the reasons why step families don't blend; they collide very often. If we take the old Brady bunch, and I'm showing my age there, but we take the Brady bunch example where we had 3 girls. We had Marsha and the younger sisters down one side, and it was Greg and the younger brothers. Marsha and Greg were about the same age. The second were about the same age, and the youngest ones were about the same age. So you had a perfect 3, first, second, third, or first, middle, youngest on both sides. And in TV, that played out beautifully. It all wonderful. And in real life, wouldn't really work out that way. You'd have a fair bit of conflict between the firstborns because it's a pretty good position to be in, and firstborns often like to retain that position. That's why often firstborn kids will let their younger brother or sister know that, hey, I'm better than you, or I'm bigger than you, or I can do this and you can't. That's retaining that position. And youngest kids are the baby of the family. As much as they complain about it, most kids who are at the foot of the family enjoy that position, and they don't like to give that up very, very easily.
Is it true they are more spoilt? They get more attention.
Yeah.
Get away with more.
Yeah. And it makes sense because what we know that mums and dads, majority of the time as parents, we're more strict on our firstborn than any other child. There's a lot more pressure on the firstborn. We do a lot of learning through the firstborns. And by the time you get to a third or fourth, your foot's off the pedal. You've relaxed a lot. You've loosened up. You realise
they're not going to break.
That's right. Youngest ones are survivors. They know that they survive. And also parents, you just get, not so much you get tired, but your attention's elsewhere. And you've already made a lot of those decisions anyway. And a simple example is when one of the a stressful time for parents is when their first child's moving into adolescence, and there's all these, Mum, I want to go out into the city. I want to go to the movies with my friend. I want to, and they're busting for more freedom. And as a parent, we go, oh, gee, I'm not sure. And we often put it off. Yeah, all right, you can go now. And, you say to your 13-year-old, and by the time you get to your youngest one, the third one, there's a good chance, unless something's happened or unless something significantly is developmentally delayed about the youngest one, there's a fairly good chance you've seen that your eldest one did survive. You've also learned a bit as well about the things to say and do, and I bet you'll let the youngest one go at 11 or 12 or a little bit younger, and that's the way things go. So they get more freedom, youngest ones, and they also do get more. They get away with more. It's probably in the families.
That diet and things like that. The firstborn, in my case, and I witnessed it around me too. It's like the vegetables every night, and no sweets, and no TV, and everything was very controlled. And trying to be the perfect parent. By the time the next one comes along, it sort of slips a little bit. What she might be having at 6, he's now having at 3.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, and that's human nature.
Mm.
And one of the interesting things, and this is why when I did some research back in the 80s and looked at the impact that family size has on parenting, and there was quite a significant difference. So when you had 2 kids or less, it's what I call a micro family, and we parented the kids individually. So by that I mean we'd often, you ensure that the first one had something that they wanted for meals, and the second one had something that they may have wanted for meals. If there was some discipline, the first one would be disciplined, and the second one, we find out who started and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. And when you get 4 or more, it becomes more tribal. We delegate a lot more. We're all going to go home because someone messed up. I don't really care who it was, but and we cook the meal that we all eat. So we step back a bit and it becomes more a group-based thing. And I guess from my perspective, in 30 odd years of parenting, probably the biggest change has been now parenting is very much an individual endeavor, as opposed to perhaps when I started as a parenting educator in the late 80s, it was far more sort of group-based. We not saying we ignored the individual, but we were more focused on, we're all going to go home. We're all going on the holiday. It was less about the individual. So,
do you think that creates more pressure for parents now?
Oh, yeah. I'm glad my kids are. The answer to that is yes. I'll finish off my sentence. I think it does add a little bit more pressure. And I think that I'm glad that my kids aren't around now, but I do see them. They're all 3 of them. They raise their kids, and they have a bit of a group-based notion around them, but they also do focus on the individuals. And I guess if I'm very honest, I know when one kid had a problem, one child had a problem, you'd focus on that child. In larger families, when we get to 5 or 6, sometimes it was an older sibling would look after that younger one. That tended to happen. The bigger the family, the more the delegation. Sometimes the child is bullied at school. It didn't actually ever get to mum or dad. It actually got an older sibling who sorted it all out. And so as we get smaller families, there's no sibling to intervene and to step in. So it's mum and dad handles the whole lot.
Everything.
The whole thing. Yeah.
Michael, can you just quickly, and I know there's way more to it, whole book to read, but can you just quickly, in very simplistic terms, maybe just identify some traits, some positive things, and also perhaps some pitfalls to look out for say, first, middle, last born?
Okay. Firstborns are, what are the positives? They're fairly achievement oriented. They tend to be more conscientious. They score high on conscientiousness. They often are detailed oriented, and they're easier to raise in some ways because they like to please. Adult approval is important to them, so they tend to play by the family rules. So thank goodness for firstborns in lots of ways, because they do get things done as well. Some of the negatives are that their achievement orientation could also means that they can be low risk takers. So low risk takers as kids is you'll often see the firstborns, particularly boys, who don't take risks as learners. They stick to the straight and narrow. I'm good at sport. I'm good at school. I'm not going to do art because I might make an idiot of myself. So I'll just stick to the things I'm good at. So that there's a tendency for perfectionism, and they score high on, sounds a weird word, but on neuroticism. They always have. And we're starting to see that they can be a little bit more anxious than other kids. They get a bit more anxious. They tend to like routines, and they're very much the rule makers. They like to have those rules as well, and rule keepers as well. They're little rule keepers. And sometimes they'll use that with their little younger brother or sister. That's the rules. So they're a little bit more black and white. Sometimes the world, they tend to be a bit more black and white.
Regimented.
Yeah, regimented. Sometimes they can see the world in a black and white aspect. Only children, very similar, but they sometimes struggle to be kids. There's two sorts of only children. There's often only girls can be extremely verbal and do fantastically well at school because they've spent a lot of time around adults, and so their verbal skills are terrific and they know how to express themselves well. So sometimes, stay out of an only girl's way because she'll cut you down, whatever way. And some boys and girls too do struggle with conflict in a school situation because I believe you practice on your siblings. You learn a lot with
the negotiation and compromise.
Yeah, giving in, sharing, all that sort of stuff. So my one sort of recommendation, if you've got a child who's an only child, is just make sure that they do keep pets, so they've got something to nurture and look after, and they learn that. And the second thing is that just they have some sleepovers and that sort of stuff. So spend time around other kids. Interestingly, we had I always say this we had an only child. He would have been about 16, 17, stay with us he was an exchange student from France years ago. And right at that time, we had my two, a boy and two girls, close together. My two daughters were about 17 and 15, and they were pretty fierce at each other with their they were a little bit feline the way they spoke to each other. And I remember that Jean-Pierre, here for 6 weeks, he came to me, Michael, in this beautiful French accent, and said, "Michael, they just fight all the time. What do I do?" And all I could say is, "Mate, just duck, stay out of trouble, and don't get caught in the crossfire." But he felt uncomfortable with that. It was new to him. Mm-hmm. So I actually had to say to the girls, which we did, and part of our job is to make kids social and to let them understand how their behaviour impacts on others. And I actually said, "Look, you might, if you're going to do that sort of fighting, go outside." He doesn't feel comfortable with it. You can't do it in front of him. Come on, fair's fair, sort of thing. And they did the right thing 90% of the time after that. So, but that was a real learning for me, and I have noticed that a lot. Sometimes only children do struggle with that. They're more comfortable in their own skin very often as well. So onlys. If you've got a second, seconds, I guess, they score very well. So seconds and middles score well on flexibility. They score well on resilience tests. I reckon they're the package in some ways. That their life is always fit in with the life of the firstborn. The firstborn sets the pattern, and the second one tends to fit in with that. So, which is a plus. And again, they'll tend to be different than the first one even in subtle ways, whether it's their interests, whether they go about doing things as well. If I've always got one tip for parents, it's actually the big complaint from seconds and middles is they don't get one-on-one time with parents. So don't be afraid to grab one on their own and come on, let's go down to the shops or let's do something together and save some, don't give them all the hand-me-downs as well. So save something new for them.
Something fresh. Yeah. Special treatment, perhaps. A little bit first like and lastborn get the special treatment.
And lastborns, look, they're a great position to be, and they tend to be a little bit more. So lastborns sit at the bottom of the family and they learn a lot. They introduced to every concept a lot earlier, and they also watch siblings, and they tend to be street smart. They see what their siblings fight with their parents about, and they don't do that. So they're masters of what we call low power conflict resolution skills. They use charm, manipulation. They'll delegate. They'll get someone else to ask their mum something that they might not get. So they're in a pretty good position. Trouble is with a lot of youngest ones is a lot of the youngest children will outdo the rest of the family. They'll be even more successful than everyone else.
Right.
Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, but they'll often do it in a different way. So if it's an academic family, reasonable chance that the youngest one might run their own business or be a tradie or do something like that. There's an interesting study on entrepreneurs and managers, and firstborns tend to be more in managerial positions in large firms, and a lot of entrepreneurs also tend to be younger borns because
They're
there's risk.
creative, problem
Yeah.
solvers, innovative.
And they're risk. They don't mind risk. Younger ones don't mind risk. I'm the youngest in the family, and I left a very secure job of teaching when my kids were, when we didn't really have a wage and had 3 kids. So youngest ones have a tendency around risk because they've always taken risks. Risk has been part of their growing up in lots of ways. One thing you can do with the youngest ones is put some pressure on them, because sometimes they miss out on, they get away with too much. So don't forget to put a little bit of pressure on them, even in a learning sense. If I suggest with your first one, stop telling them to study, you may have to tell your younger one, you need to study, that sort of stuff.
So pull the pressure back on the first one, maybe reapply it elsewhere.
Yeah.
That's
some general rules. I mean, everyone is listening to this. You're going to use your own common sense. You know your own kids. I mean, I've got a youngest one who fits that pattern to a fair degree, but she's also highly driven. So she was more successful than the others at school, but we had to actually say to her, stop studying so hard in year 12. You're going to do yourself, blow a foofer valve, which she did. So again, not everything follows all the time. But
trends.
Yeah.
Have you come across any, have you done any research on any relationship between mental emotional disorders and birth order?
There is quite a bit out. And I'm going to be a little bit careful in saying that one of the issues around birth order research is that you need longevity and you need big numbers for it to be, relevant, useful. And there's quite a bit of research around birth order, which is using small numbers, just looking at 1 or 2 things. And so the data can really change a lot. And so I've often been said, birth order is quite flaky. And my response is, it is well researched and it fits within a family context. It's flaky when you take it outside and say, just because you're going to be a leader in a position, in a leader in your family, therefore all presidents are going to be firstborn. That's stretching it. That's stretching it. But there has been some good work done in mental health, and kids in the firstborn area, they're the most at risk. They're the most at risk. And there's for a couple of reasons for that. One of them is probably the strongest reason is and I think this is a more societal thing as well, is the fact that a lot of firstborns are high achievers. They're driven. They're going to cut through. Their identities sometimes is made up of their success. So a success in a career or work is important for their identity, which I think if you extrapolate and take that back, that's also got something to do with the identity, which is shaped around parents and that pedestal, etc. And that high achievement can come at a cost if you don't look after your mental health. And so, I've known people who are introverts who act like extroverts, and because they want to achieve. You might be talking to one now, and so they'll drive through that and to do that and put themselves into those positions. But there's a real cost if you don't look after your mental health. So I think if you've got one of the absolute keys is to embed good mental health practices and knowledge into your family while you raise your kids. And it may be more important for some kids than others. So when we wrote our Anxious Kids book, we found that there's some kids are genetically more prone to to anxiety than others. It comes in the family, and it needs to be you need to be put in that context sometimes for that anxiety to occur. So you could be anxiety prone, but live in a cabin out in the middle of nowhere with no pressure on you.
Not going to be
anxious. He's anxious. Nothing to be anxious about here. But as soon as you start to put pressure on, as soon as you go into social situations, you have exams, you have COVID, then anxiety starts to come with those sorts of kids. So part of the The environmental factor is the birth order factor, is the fact that kids are first. And it's almost an environmental factor that if you are genetically prone to be anxious, there's a good chance because you're born first and you've got a little bit more drive that you're going to experience anxiety. So you need to understand yourself. You need to know how to give yourself breaks. You need to be able to manage your state in lots of ways. So I think that's fairly, quite significant. And we know that mental health, a lot of mental health issues such as, depression and anxiety comes from being hard driven achievement wise. It's not always something's happened in your life. Therefore, often it comes as it's the cost. And I think you're seeing that with, Naomi Osaka at the moment who's the tennis player who's opted out of at the French Open, opted out of interviews, because it's in, she's said, I've experienced depression for a long time, and this makes me anxious. So there's your perfect example. I don't know her birth order position, but I bet she's firstborn. I seriously do, and that's a classic example of I'm achieving. I'm going to do this sort of stuff. It makes me anxious, so I've got to mitigate as much as possible things to do away with anything which makes me externally anxious, so I can just focus on tennis. Obviously, that does, for her, good on her for standing up and saying that. So.
On that note, Michael, just thinking of, your work with Jodie, the book Anxious Kids, but also Jodie's work on, anxious parents, things like that. I suppose it's important to consider as parents our birth order and, how we parent as a result of that too.
Yeah, look, if you we do parent according to our birth order. It's one of those things. It's why is it so? Well, when we come into the job of raising kids, we bring a lot of ghosts from the past with us. We bring our own experiences, and certainly we bring our own birth order experiences into the job. So if you're a firstborn yourself, you've got a firstborn, reasonable chance that you're going to, it's going to be a serious job. You're learning, you want to do it right. And you bring that youngest born aspect into it. If you're youngest in the family, and you tend to parent the same way. And I've experienced that with my wife and I, with our kids. I was the youngest in a family of four, and I gave my kids as much freedom as I got, which was a fair bit. If I were doing, I think he's old enough to do that. My wife was sort of the eldest of, a family of five, and one who passed away. So obviously the protection was very high on the agenda there. So it brings that into it, and parented like a firstborn, which was, I'm not sure, is that giving her freedom was quite different. Also wanting to have every box ticked, etc., was also there as well with her parenting. So, and that's fine. It's just good to understand where you come from, where your partner comes from, and work things out. So it does impact. I think it impacts also in another way that secretly, and I've talked to a lot of people about this, we often will identify with the same birth order position as us. And I certainly do with my youngest one.
Compatible though?
Yeah, a little bit. You get what it's like for them. So my youngest one was always thought that life was unfair. And I always thought life was unfair at the time. And I could identify with that because, my family stopped going on family holidays when all the other kids had grown up. So I sort of missed out on the holidays, and I thought, what about me? And I used to feel ripped off then. And I saw Sarah my youngest one would often miss out on things because the older kids are gone. And so we go, oh, no, we're not going to go to movies anymore because the elders don't go. And she would, or she'd be sitting there on her own. And I used to identify with that really strongly and go, oh, you poor thing. And I'd often do, like a lot of dads do with their youngest daughters, I try and make it up to her. So yeah, there's that aspect as well. So again, that's not a conscious thing. I think it's an unconscious thing. And when we raise our kids, we do come up with a lot of baggage, good or bad baggage. And the birth order is one other piece of baggage. And I think it's just good to sort of tweak onto that and go, all right. Okay,
does the same apply in relationships, in adult relationships as well, as far as friends, partners, things like that? The birth order do we identify more with people in the same place as us, or can it create conflict?
I think what often happens is that opposites attract and work well together. So, but it doesn't always happen that way. I've seen, I think of firstborns can be, we tend to, as if we relate to each other like firstborns, sometimes it's who's winning this partnership. And we'd like to be very, very organized. My family might run like clockwork. And I think we've all seen those families where just, the lunches are made the night before and kids get up at the right time, everything works well. And there's a fair chance that both parents are firstborns. Not saying they are, but it's a fair chance, or a firstborn's running the show. And the second and the other parent allows that and steps right back and doesn't interfere, which in some ways is the youngest born strategy. But for those families, sometimes there's a lot of tension. They're very serious places. And I know a lot of families who are only children families who've got an only child, parents are only kids, and they've got an only child themselves. They want to do everything well.
Very adult-like?
Yeah, very adult-like. Yeah. So it does impact.
Great. Michael, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, there is not. You've covered quite a bit of ground.
Great. Thank you very much for your time. Wonderful book, which helps us, I think, as a parent and also in our day-to-day relationships with others and in understanding ourselves as well. Yeah.
The only other thing I'd say, and I'll just say quickly, I think teachers should get behind a little bit more. And I'll just say that there's here's an interesting example. There's a foundation class, which is the first year in primary school in Victoria. I was speaking to the teacher recently, 21 kids in that class, 15 of them are firstborns. So, wow, it's a different class than a class of 15 youngest kids. And so why I was tipped off at that, because I said to my friend, I said, how's it going? And she said, oh, good, the kids are fine, but the parents are, I feel like I've got to hold their hand. So I asked her to do what we call a birth order audit, which I actually put in the book, how to do a birth order audit, which is you put the ages of the kids and everyone else in the family down. So you get a quick look at it. So a birth order audit in my family is, let's go back when my eldest was 10. So I'd have male 10, I'd have a female 9 and female 7. So you quickly look at it and so that's a birth order audit. So it's in the book. So teacher did a birth order audit.
Here it is.
That's it.
Page 33.
You're a gem. Thank you. And it's really useful. They're great.
I'm going to try that with my own.
You can do it on either side of your family. So you see where you fit in, where your partner fits in. Anyway, very quickly, she did a birth order audit and found out there was 15 firstborns. And of course, not only is school new for 15 kids, but school's new for 15 parents as well. So
I don't envy her position.
No, that's right. That's right. So she's got to do a lot of communicating with parents. And of course, imagine if there was 15 of those were the youngest kids in the family, the parents probably have trouble sometimes with some of the parents getting them up for interviews because they've been there, done that. Yeah. All right.
Lovely. Thanks very much for your time, Michael.